Our reporter Liabo Setho spoke to the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Guy Ryder, and Minister of Employment and Labour, Thulas Nxesi.
Deliberations have been continuing here at the Chief Nxesi Albert Luthuli International Convention Center, where the conference on the elimination of child labor, the fifth global conference that has been taking place. As we conclude this evening, we have invited two important people at the center of this conversation. That is Mr. Guy Ryder. He's the Director General of the International Labour Organization, and of course the Minister of Employment and Labour, Mr. Thulas Nxesi. We will find out how international commitments fuse together with domestic commitments that have been made here today. This conference is important in that, we have a deadline that has to do with SDGs, particularly SDG 8.7, that speaks of totally eliminating and eradicating child labor by 2025 and in other elements by 2030. But how are those commitments coming along? How has the pandemic also impacted on these plans? Mr. Guy Ryder has been heard during this conference talking about how there's been a slowdown in the commitments and the push that has been made. Mr. Ryder, welcome to SABC News. Tell us more about this slowdown that you have detected as the ILO and how it impacts on the plans, that the SDG goals that we are trying to meet.
Yeah, as you've already mentioned, we set ourselves a goal. The United Nations set the goal for 2025 for the complete elimination of child labour in the world. And the bad news, I'm afraid, is that there are still 160 million children in child labour right now. That's a big number. And the even worse news is we're going backwards, not forwards. Over the last 4 years, we've seen an increase of some 8 million in those figures. And this comes after a period of very rapid decline. Yeah. So it's a surprising, to my mind, and very worrying turnaround. And you've mentioned COVID has hit, because this increase was evident pre-COVID. And I'm afraid the fear is that with COVID, the lockdowns, the increased vulnerability of working families, we don't have the exact figures, let me be clear, but we suspect, subject to confirmation, that COVID could have added another nearly 9 million to the number of child labourers. So we're not going in the right direction, which makes this conference very, very important.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ryder. Minister, one could argue that South Africa is somewhat fortunate in that Statistics South Africa tells me that there's less than 5% of child labourers in the country. This is, of course, those that they have surveyed within their quarterly labour force survey. But what are we doing as a country to keep the numbers down? Eventually, we do want to see a 0%.
I think it has to do with our robust labour laws, which are informed by the Constitution, the issue of the rights, the human rights and the rights of the children. We have a number of programs where we are pulling the children back to school. The compulsory education, basic education for the children is very helpful. The issue of the various grants which we are having, where the children from poor families, they are able to access those grants, which means they can't go and do the work. Instead, they must come back to school and they can use those grants. You can see now during the COVID times when jobs were destroyed, we've come up with the 350. And there's a big debate now about the basic income grant, which means instead of those children going to find some work to feed these families, the families are able to get something and then the children are back at school. So I would say, therefore, the issue of social protection, which is very key.
Yes.
It's in top of the agenda. So the programs which we have put in place, the country has spent a lot of money to put those programs.
Mr. Ryder, I can imagine what the minister is saying about what South Africa is doing, that these are the kind of interventions we want to see. But of course, not every country is so fortunate, like a developing economy like South Africa, to have the budget amid a constrained fiscus, of course, to be able to even pay those 350s. Have you been able to get what other countries are doing to try and keep up with perhaps what South Africa is trying to do?
Yeah, what the Minister has just said resonates very, very clearly at the international level. I think what we've heard from the beginning of this conference are the three drivers of child labour, the negative drivers of child labour: lack of educational access, lack of social protection. I would add as well high levels of informality in labour markets. This is really very, very important. And then, of course, poverty amongst adults. If adults are not earning a decent living, the push of child labourers, of children into child labour is all the greater. Now, you know, you've mentioned the incidence of child labour in South Africa, 5.6%, if I got it right. The global figure's just under 10%. In sub-Saharan Africa, at 24%. And that indicates to you, doesn't it, that because of the structural features of African labour markets and also the lack of resources which you've asked me about, not everybody has been able to follow the South African path. And I think it is precisely, and this has come out strongly in the debates now, it's a matter of moving towards universal social protection systems and financing them and improving compulsory schooling, which really has to be there. Now, I think there's a double responsibility here. There's a responsibility to mobilize domestic resources within the realms of what is possible in African economies and others as well, but there's an international piece to this as well. And if the United Nations wants to stay honest, I would say, to the SDGs, the money has to come. The financing has also to complement the national efforts internationally.
Understood. Minister, the conversations in the corridors and among my colleagues here indeed was the role of labour inspectors, okay, and also the porous borders in South Africa, where we're seeing our neighbouring countries, obviously people coming, economic migrants coming to, you know, try to make a living for themselves, and how they are more at risk of, particularly those children, are more at risk of being in child labour. I'll give you an example. You might find a 14-year-old who is willing to do domestic work simply because they have a family to feed out there. What is the policy response among yourself and when you talk with your colleagues in government about how you can work together to try and address this issue?
Labour migration is an international phenomenon. What is important is for it to be regulated properly. We are signatories to the various international conventions to deal with the economic refugees and political refugees. So they also have the rights in terms of our constitution. But there are expectations from South Africans, because what the employers tend to do is to want to employ the desperate refugees whom they know that they can take anything, and they can undermine the labor standards, the employers, and that's distorting the labor market. And thirdly, we have to deal with the issue of what we call proper regulating the issue of porous borders.
Yeah.
Because it is through the porous borders that kids are being trafficked, and criminal syndicates are behind all those.
Are you speaking to the Department of Home Affairs about this?
Definitely.
And
that's why
saying?
the Department of Home Affairs today and through the cabinet has come up with the Border Management Agency, special structure which is looking at how do we deal with the management of the borders. They've already appointed a number of people at the top level. They are putting the structures, working with the other departments in order to deal with that matter. But also, even in the country, we didn't have a proper labor migration policy. It was started at SADC that all the countries, they need to have that, and all of us are doing that. In South Africa, we've just released a document, the proposed National Labor Migration Policy, which looks into all these issues, how we're going to deal or regulate the labor migration policy. I must say this, we continue to condemn people like the Dudula who are just using violence to deal with what they see as illegal immigrants. Our argument is that those are people, they are not animals, they have the human rights, and we must find a constructive way of dealing with that particular influx.
What is this constructive way?
The constructive way is we put the proper legislation. We deal with the illegal people, we control the borders, but we must accept that there's international trade.
Yeah.
We're talking about the movement of goods and services across the borders.
Yeah.
We're talking about also the movement of people, but it must be properly controlled. Those are the constructive ways of dealing with it.
Right. Let me get into the corporates and also the financing. I understand that the European Union has pledged about 168.8 million today to programs that will help with eradication. And one social activist, in fact, saying that there needs to be support or investment of around 53 billion US dollars. How much exactly will it take for the global community to eventually put money in the kitty and say, this is what we are using to eliminate child labor?
Yes, the European Union announced in the conference today some important investments in two particular areas. On the regulation of global supply chains, which has a particular relevance to child labour issues, and on education. And I think the piece on education is very, very important. The figure you mentioned, an activist mentioned a figure which is what it would cost each year to provide basic social protection platforms for the least developed, for the lowest income economies, and it's in the billions. It's a lot of money. The United Nations has set itself again this ambition. The Secretary General's launched what he calls a global accelerator to collect funds and to use funds for social protection. But, you know, there's no denying this is a very big bill, and it won't come all at one go. It will not.
And where will it come from?
And who is going to put the money up? Yeah. And again, I think what you have to understand, what we have to understand, is the international community will put money in as a catalyst, as a seed money. But there's no way they can pick up the whole bill. So it's a matter of conjugating international support, including direct finance, with the domestic resource effort. I'm afraid this is not an easy agenda, but it is the one that is realistically on the table.
Right. Gentlemen, as I conclude, Minister, may I just conclude with you? In my conversation with a representative from the Business Unity of South Africa, he points out that, you know, we should be looking into informal small businesses and how child labor is quite prevalent there. And most of these businesses may be doing this unknowingly, you know, not knowing, you know, that a child working a certain number of hours constitute child labor, and if it interferes with their schooling, if it is hazardous job, to them it is a business, perhaps maybe it's a family business. How would you work perhaps with the Department of Small Businesses in order to make awareness about the role of small and informal businesses?
If you listen to the discussions today, the issue of informality was one of the big issues where child labor is rife.
Yes.
That's an area which we need to focus on and put the strategies. But remember, we're not talking about the normal chores which the children have to do. We're talking about hazardous situations. We're talking about kids who are forced to do even domestic work, which blocks them from doing their work or going to school, doing their homework, or even going to school.
Yeah.
So these are all the issues which we're putting in the package so that we can be able to look at and be able to deal with them. By the way, one of the things which I didn't mention here, which is, I think, is the biggest positive in the country, is the school feeding scheme. Right. Which has brought lots of kids back to school where they are supposed to be. So the issue of informality, we are looking at it. Because the reason why those kids are there, it's because of poverty. But if we have the poverty relief schemes, we are able also to deal with that informality. And once the kids are at school,
they're safe.
Our argument is very simple. This conference should be seen as an investment in the future of children and social justice.
Minister Nxesi, thank you so much. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Mr. Ryder, I believe that you are going back to Geneva tomorrow morning. Safe travels, sir. Minister, you'll still be with us. We will be asking you to join us every now and then throughout the week, just so that we get updates on what's happening on your front. But gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on SABC News. Here with me is the Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Guy Ryder, on my left, and my far left is the Minister of Employment and Labour, Mr. Thulas Nxesi. We've been talking all things elimination of child labor in Africa and the world and what can be done. And that's all from us from Durban for tonight. It's back to you in studio.